The night was colder than usual, and the wind carried with it the kind of silence that made every creak of the wooden floor feel heavier than it should. Out on the plains, the world seemed endless rolling fields, broken only by weathered fences and the occasional lantern light from a distant homestead. In this part of the country, late in the 1800s, life was simple but dangerous. Folks worked hard, prayed harder, and trusted little beyond the calloused grip of their own hands. That's why when trouble came, it didn't always announce itself with shouting or gunfire. Sometimes it crept up quiet, like a shadow stretching long across the walls of a lonely rancher's house. The woman who lived there was known in the nearby village, though not too well. People said she kept to herself, living at the edge of the settlement where the grassland pressed against the thick line of timber. Her husband had passed some years back, and while most would have fled to the safety of town or kinfolk, she stayed behind, holding fast to the house they had built with sweat and patience. A single lantern often burned late into the night through her window, a silent sign of her presence to the few who passed that way. But what nobody knew, what even the boldest of bandits failed to imagine, was who she truly lived with. That evening, the house stood sturdy against the storm clouds that gathered across the horizon. A fire snapped inside the stone hearth, throwing flickers of orange across the room's rough boards. The woman knelt near the table, hands busy mending a torn sleeve, when a sudden rattle at the door jolted her still. She held her breath, listening. In these parts, a knock past sundown rarely meant a neighborly visit. Before she could move, the door gave way with a violent crack, and figures in dusted coats and bandanas stormed in. The outlaws had been riding all day, drawn by rumor that the lonely widow kept valuables tucked away, silver, gold, or maybe cattle money hidden in the floorboards. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Their boots stomped across the planks, their voices low and coarse as they ordered her to stand aside. The leader, a tall man with eyes like cold iron, shoved her back toward the wall. "Quiet now," he hissed, pointing his revolver. "And you won't get hurt." She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked past him toward the far corner of the room. It was a small glance, easy to miss, but the bandit didn't notice. He was too busy waving his pistol and barking at his men to start searching. The air inside grew tight, heavy with tension. The outlaws began tearing through drawers and overturning chairs, unaware that the true danger in that room didn't stand on two legs. In the shadows by the window, unseen by the intruders, two pairs of eyes glowed faintly against the dim firelight eyes that belonged not to men but to beasts. Wolves, large and silent, their fur bristling as they crouched low, waiting. They were not ordinary strays, not half-starved scavengers prowling the woods. These wolves were hers, companions, guardians, bound to her in ways no stranger could fathom. She had raised them since they were cubs, and in return, they had given her their loyalty, their strength, and their protection. Out here, where lawmen were scarce and the land unforgiving, they were family. The woman steadied her breath, forcing calm where fear threatened to rise. She had seen this kind of cruelty before men who thought a lone house was easy prey. What they hadn't counted on was that this house, her house, was not empty. And though she never sought violence, she knew that survival sometimes demanded it. The wolves shifted quietly, muscles taut, eyes locked on the intruders. The woman's hand brushed the floor beside her, as if to remind them, not yet. One of the bandits kicked open a trunk by the hearth, cursing when he found nothing but old quilts. "Ain't here," he spat, throwing the lid shut. The leader's jaw tightened as he turned back to the woman. "Where is it?" he demanded. She said nothing. Her silence seemed to stoke their anger, but beneath her calm gaze her mind raced. Timing mattered now. One wrong move and the night could end in blood, hers. Theirs or both. The wind outside moaned against the shutters, and for a fleeting second it drowned the sound of a low growl that rumbled through the room. The bandits froze, brows furrowing as their eyes darted about. "You hear that?" one muttered. Another laughed nervously. "Just the storm." But then it came again, deeper, sharper, impossible to mistake. The sound of teeth bared in warning. From the shadows, the wolves stepped forward, their presence undeniable, their bodies taut with feral strength. The leader stumbled back a step, shock flickering across his hardened face. "What in?" he began, but the words died on his tongue. The woman finally spoke, her voice steady, almost calm. "You should leave." It was not a plea nor a threat, but something in between. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who knew the cost of bloodshed, yet would not back down. The bandits glanced at each other, hands tightening on their weapons. They had expected a defenseless widow, not a woman who stood unflinching with wolves at her side. The standoff thickened, fire snapping louder as though echoing the tension. One wolf snarled, lips curling to reveal sharp teeth, while the other circled, its black fur blending with the shadows. The bandits shuffled uneasily, torn between greed and fear. Every second stretched longer, heavier, as if the whole house held its breath. The woman didn't move, her eyes fixed on the men, her hand close to the floor. She knew the next heartbeat would decide everything, whether these intruders walked out, or whether the wolves would be unleashed. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows large against the walls. Outside, the storm finally broke, thunder rolling across the plains. And in that instant, just as the leader raised his pistol, the wolves lunged forward with a fury that turned the air wild and alive. The night had only just begun. The wolves leaped, their snarls ripping through the small cabin louder than the storm outside. The bandits shouted in surprise, stumbling backward as the heavy animals lunged with teeth bared and eyes locked. The leader fired his pistol, the crack deafening in the wooden room. But the shot went wide, splintering a board near the ceiling. Chaos broke out. The fires glowed, dancing across frightened faces as boots scraped the floor. The woman didn't flinch. She stayed low, steady, watching her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She knew her wolves weren't reckless. They never struck unless she allowed it, and even now, they weren't biting. They were holding the outlaws frozen in place, forcing them to feel what true danger looked like. The tall man cursed, swinging his revolver wildly toward the gray wolf, who stood bristled over the body of one of his men who had stumbled during the commotion. The black wolf circled from behind, its eyes glowing as though the fire itself had seeped into its pupils. The outlaws had expected easy prey, a simple theft in a quiet home. Now they found themselves trapped in a room where every shadow felt alive and every breath they took felt borrowed. The woman spoke again, her voice calm, carrying a tone that seemed almost unnatural in the panic of the moment. "You broke into the wrong house," she said. Her words weren't shouted, yet they cut sharper than the storm outside. The bandits exchanged nervous glances. They weren't used to this. They were used to victims begging, crying, not staring them down with steady eyes and wolves at their side. The leader tried to recover his footing, his pride refusing to let him back away. "They're just animals," he muttered through clenched teeth. But even as he said it, the way his hand trembled betrayed him. He'd been around enough to know wild creatures didn't act like this. Not trained, not disciplined, not waiting for a single cue to move. These wolves weren't ordinary, and the woman wasn't either. The storm raged harder, rattling the window shutters. For a moment, the thunder seemed to drown out everything, and then the house fell into silence except for the steady growl vibrating from the wolves' throats. The bandits stood rigid, too afraid to move, too stubborn to retreat. And in that silence, the weight of the woman's life pressed heavy across the room. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to take from her. It wouldn't be the last either. But each time it happened, it reminded her of the promise she had made long ago to never leave the land she and her husband had carved out, no matter the cost. Years before, when her husband had still lived, they had chosen this spot for its wild beauty. The open plains stretched wide, but the woods nearby offered shelter and hunting. They built the house with their own hands, laying each beam and board, filling it with the sound of laughter and the scent of bread baking in the hearth. Neighbors thought them foolish to live so far from town, with only the sound of coyotes at night and the threat of raiders on lonely trails. But he had always said, "This land is ours because we dared to stay." And she had believed him when he was taken by illness. Many assumed she would return to her family or find comfort among the church folk in town. But she didn't either. She stayed. She stayed because the land had his memory in it. She stayed because the house was more than wood, it was a promise. And in time, when she found the wolf pups abandoned near the timberline, she saw it as a sign. They were small and weak, eyes still cloudy with youth, and she nursed them by the fire through long nights. Those wolves grew into something fierce, loyal, and unyielding. Just like the bond she had with this land, the bandits knew none of this, of course. To them, she was just a woman in a worn dress, standing in a house too quiet and too far from town. They didn't see the years of hardship in her posture or the quiet fire in her eyes. They saw only what they thought would be easy gain. But now, staring into the wolf's teeth, they were beginning to question everything. The leader tried to steady himself, lowering his pistol just slightly as though weighing the odds. "We didn't come for blood," he said slowly. "Just give us what you got, and we'll be gone." His men looked at him, some with doubt, others with fear. The storm outside howled, pressing against the windows as if the night itself wanted in. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the lantern beside her and lifted it. Its glow spilled brighter across the room, casting long shadows that made the wolf's presence even more haunting. She held the light steady, her face calm but unreadable. "What I've got," she said, "is not for the likes of you." Her words weren't angry. Yet they left no room for debate. One of the younger outlaws shifted nervously, muttering under his breath. He hadn't signed on for this. He had joined for quick money, a bit of silver to ease the hunger gnawing at his belly, not to test his luck against beasts that looked ready to tear him apart. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating the risk of making a run for it. But the leader noticed and barked, "Don't you dare." The wolves growled louder, picking up on the rising panic. The woman felt their energy tense and ready, but she didn't move her hand from her side. She knew they would wait for her signal. She also knew that men like these didn't give up easily. Desperation had brought them here. Desperation was dangerous. Her mind drifted briefly to the stories whispered in the village about nights like this, stories of bandits roaming the back roads, of ranchers found robbed and broken. She had listened without showing fear, knowing her home would never be taken so easily. But now, as the bandits' eyes shifted nervously and the storm thundered above, she wondered if this was the night her resolve would truly be tested. The leader's jaw worked as he struggled to decide. He could call his men to fire, but he wasn't certain they'd win. He could order a retreat, but that would mean losing face. And men like him lived on their reputation. For him, fear of shame was almost worse than fear of death. The woman watched him closely, sensing his pride battling his reason. She knew men like him, and she knew pride often led to ruin. Still, she didn't underestimate him. Men who had lived by the gun were unpredictable. And while her wolves were fierce, she also knew the risk of a bullet was real. She didn't want bloodshed, but she couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The storm crashed again, rattling the window so hard it nearly burst. One of the shutters banged loose, letting in a gust of cold air that swept through the room. The fire flickered wildly, shadows leaping across the walls. The bandits flinched at the sudden noise, their nerves unraveling. The gray wolf snarled and took a step closer, teeth glinting in the light. The leader steadied his hand on the revolver again, his eyes locked on the woman. He thought if he could break her, the wolves might falter. But what he didn't understand was that her strength wasn't for show. It came from years of survival, from nights of loneliness, where she had only her own courage to keep her warm. She wasn't pretending. She was ready. For a moment, nobody moved. The wolves crouched, the bandits froze, the woman stood like stone. The storm outside reached its height, thunder shaking the earth itself. Then, just as the leader's finger brushed the trigger again, a new sound echoed from deep within the woods beyond the house, a howl, long and piercing, carried on the wind. It was answered by another, and then another, until the night was alive with voices. The bandit's eyes went wide. The woman did not move, but in her chest, her heart beat steady. The wolves at her side didn't flinch at the sound. Instead, their ears pricked, and their growls deepened. The men realized then, with a chill that cut deeper than the storm. That the two wolves inside were not alone. The night still had secrets to show. And the danger was far from over. The howls rolled across the plains like echoes of the storm, filling the night with an eerie chorus. Inside the rancher's house, every man stiffened, their eyes darting toward the shuttered window as though the voices of the wild might come pouring in through the cracks. The bandits had thought the wolves at her side were strange enough, but now, the forest alive beyond the cabin walls, the truth began to sink in. She didn't live alone out here. Not truly. And what guarded her was not bound by fence or rope, but by something deeper. Something that made the land itself feel like an ally. The gray wolf let out a sharp bark, pacing a step toward the leader of the intruders. Its teeth glistened in the firelight, saliva stringing from its mouth. The black wolf lingered near the window, ears pricked, tail low but steady, waiting for whatever was calling from beyond the storm. The woman stood still, one hand on the table's edge, her other clenched in the folds of her skirt. She wasn't frightened, though her pulse quickened. What unsettled her was not the wolves' voices outside, but the timing of it all. The land had a way of answering when it was needed most, but she never knew if it would answer in time. The bandits were not men who believed in omens. They had lived too long with their own cruelty to fear superstition. But even the hardest outlaw could not ignore the call of wolves in the dark. It was a sound older than any gun, older than the cabins and barns that dotted the prairie. It reminded them that for all their bullets and steel, they were still flesh and bone in a world that did not forgive weakness. The leader tried to break the spell. He slammed the butt of his revolver against the table, startling the younger men. "Shut your ears to it," he barked. "Ain't nothing but wild dogs." His tone was sharp, but his eyes betrayed unease. He turned back to the woman. "You think you scare us with tricks? You're 1 against 4. Hand over what you got, and we'll let you be." The woman didn't flinch. "You already see what I've got," she replied softly, "and you're not leaving with it." Her defiance stirred something dangerous in the room. One of the bandetsa, wiry fellow with a scar across his cheek, spat on the floor and raised his rifle halfway. "I say we end this now. She's bluffing." His voice was shaky, though, and the wolves responded with low growls, their bodies angled forward like drawn bows. But another outlaw, the younger one with restless eyes, whispered, "What if she ain't? What if there's more outside?" He glanced nervously toward the window where the storm pressed harder, lightning flashing briefly to reveal the dark tree line in the distance. The howls had faded for now, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that promised movement you couldn't see yet. The woman watched them tear at each other with doubt, knowing that fear was more powerful than her wolves. She had learned long ago that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about patience, letting your enemy destroy themselves before lifting a hand. Still, her heart weighed heavy. She did not want blood staining her floors, nor did she want the wolves forced into violence. But if the men pushed further, she would have no choice. The storm pounded the roof, thunder rolling close enough to shake the glass panes. One of the shutters slammed loose again, letting a rush of icy air sweep into the room. The lantern flickered, nearly snuffing out before catching steady once more. The leader's eyes darted toward the window, then back at her, and for the first time he looked less certain of his grip on the night. While the men argued in harsh whispers, the woman's thoughts turned inward. She remembered the winter after her husband's death, when sickness swept through the settlement and took children, elders, and half the cattle in the valley. She had stayed alone, tending to herself, listening at night as wolves roamed the ridge. Most villagers cursed the predators, hunting them down whenever possible. But she hadn't. She had left scraps out in the snow, food she could hardly spare. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was mercy, but the wolves had remembered. When spring came, the cubs followed her trails and she raised them, thinking only to repay a debt. Now, years later, it seemed that bond had grown into something far larger than she had ever expected. One of the bandits broke the silence, his voice low but urgent. "Boss, we need to leave. I don't like this. There's something wrong here." He swallowed, eyes flicking between the wolves and the shutter banging in the storm. We can find another place, another night. But the leader shook his head. We leave empty-handed. We starve. You want to explain that to the others waiting for us back camp? His voice softened only slightly. This woman's hiding something. We came too far to walk away. The tension thickened until it felt like the very air was strangling them all. The wolves crouched lower, the fire cracked louder, and the storm seemed to grow teeth outside. The woman stood rooted, knowing the next move was out of her hands. Then, from the woods came another sound, this one different. Not a howl, but the faint thud of hooves. The bandits' heads snapped toward the window at once. Riders. One whispered, his voice tight. The woman said nothing, though her own mind raced. Few traveled in this weather, and fewer still came this far out. Whoever it was, their arrival could either be salvation or ruin. The outlaws shifted uneasily, torn between the threat inside and the unknown outside. Their leader cursed under his breath, pacing a step as he weighed choices. He was a man used to controlling the moment. But tonight the moment was slipping from his hands like water through cracked leather. The wolves growled again, their eyes darting toward the door this time. They sensed something approaching long before it would arrive. The woman pressed her palm flat against the table, feeling the vibrations of the storm, the weight of the bandits' greed, and the pull of the unknown rider who neared. Subplots twisted into her thoughts. Was it someone from town? A neighbor who had braved the storm? Or was it another outlaw? Someone allied with these men, late to the raid. She thought of the sheriff, an old man with too few deputies to cover such wide land. He wouldn't come this far at night, nor would the church folk. Whoever it was, they were part of the story now, and their presence would either save her or complicate matters beyond repair. The younger bandit gripped his rifle tighter, his voice barely more than a whisper. If it's more of them wolves, I ain't staying. It ain't wolves, the leader snapped, though his certainty cracked in his tone. He turned back to the woman, his eyes narrowing. You called for someone. You knew we were coming. She shook her head slowly, her calm unwavering. I didn't need to call. Her words, though simple, unsettled them more than any growl. The scarred outlaw spat again, trying to mask his fear with anger. She's playing us, boss. Let me take her down. End this before it gets worse. But the leader raised his hand, silencing him. He was listening now to the storm, to the hooves that grew louder, and to the steady heartbeat of danger filling the cabin. He didn't trust the woman, but he feared misjudging her more. The wolves tensed. Their bodies angled toward the door as if they already knew what was about to arrive. The woman steadied herself, eyes on the flickering lantern. Whatever came through that door would change everything. The bandits' nerves frayed as the sound of the rider grew clearer, until finally the crunch of hooves on frozen earth stopped just outside the cabin. Silence followed, broken only by the faint creak of leather and the drip of rain from a wide-brimmed hat. The door that had been broken, opened by the outlaws, now stood as the only barrier between all of them and whoever waited beyond. The woman's breath caught in her throat. The wolves growled low, like thunder rolling beneath the floorboards. The storm hushed for a moment, as though the night itself leaned in to listen. Then came a knock, slow, heavy, deliberate. The wolves stiffened. The bandits froze, and the woman whispered under her breath. So faint it was nearly swallowed by the wind. It begins. The knock at the door echoed like a hammer against stone. It was steady, slow, and deliberate, as if whoever stood outside had no reason to hurry. Inside, the air turned sharp with tension. The wolves stiffened, their bodies angled toward the broken frame of the doorway, their growls rising low and deep. The woman felt the sound crawl through her bones. She glanced at the bandits, and for the first time since they had broken in, their bravado cracked wide open. No one spoke at first. Even the storm seemed to hesitate, its roar hushed for a few breaths, as though waiting for an answer. Then the leader broke the silence, his voice rough, but betraying his unease. "Don't open it," he barked, though the command was more to himself than anyone else. His pistol shook slightly in his hand, as his eyes darted between the woman, the wolves, and the door. The knock came again. Louder this time. Whoever it was, They knew they were heard. The younger bandit muttered a curse under his breath and backed away from the entry, pressing himself against the wall as though distance alone could shield him. The scarred one tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw set in anger, but his eyes betrayed fear. The woman did not move. She simply stared at the door, calm as though she had expected this moment all along. Her silence unsettled them more than words ever could. The leader noticed and snapped at her. "Who is it? Who's out there?" She met his eyes, her voice steady. "You'll find out soon enough." The words cut deep, and the leader cursed, pacing as he tried to make sense of it all. He was a man used to being in control, to storming into places and taking what he pleased. But here, in this small cabin with wolves at his throat and something unknown waiting outside, the ground beneath him felt unsteady. The knock came a third time, followed by silence. Then came the sound of boots shifting in the mud, the faint creak of leather as someone dismounted a horse. The leader motioned to one of his men. "Go check," he ordered, but the bandit shook his head quickly, fear plain on his face. "You go," the scarred one muttered. "You're the one giving orders." The tension snapped for a moment as the outlaws turned on each other, whispering harshly, their nerves unraveling. The wolves growled again, sensing the weakness, and the woman's gaze stayed fixed on the door, her breath steady even as her heart raced. At last, the latch gave a faint rattle. The broken door creaked inward, slow as though pushed by an invisible hand. Rain blew in with the wind, scattering droplets across the wooden floor. And then, framed in the opening, a shadow appeared. A tall figure stepped inside, hat dripping with rain, coat dark and heavy from the storm. They did not speak. Not yet. The wolves held their ground, their hackles raised, their eyes glowing in the dim lantern light. The bandits raised their weapons, though their hands shook. The woman studied the newcomer, her mind running through every possibility. Was this an ally? Another danger? Or something else entirely? The figure finally spoke, voice low, steady, with the kind of weight that commanded attention. "Quite the gathering you've got here." The leader stepped forward, gun aimed, though his voice cracked slightly. "Who are you?" The figure tilted their head, rainwater dripping from the brim of their hat. "That depends. Who are you to break into a house that isn't yours?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. The voice carried no fear, no hesitation. Whoever this was, they were not here by chance. The bandits muttered among themselves, confusion gnawing at their nerves. The younger one whispered, "Sheriff," though his voice was laced with doubt. The sheriff was an old man, frail and worn. This was not him, the leader snarled, trying to regain control. "This ain't your business, stranger." But the figure stepped forward into the firelight, revealing a face carved with lines of weather and time, eyes sharp as steel. "Everything out here is my business when it involves wolves and blood." The wolves growled at the word, shifting but not attacking. The woman glanced at them, then back at the stranger. Something in their eyes told her this was not the first time they had crossed paths with creatures of the wild. The tension in the room thickened. Now it was no longer just the woman against the bandits. It was something larger, a clash of wills, with the storm outside pressing down on all of them. The leader raised his pistol higher, his pride refusing to give way. "One more step, and I'll put you down." The stranger didn't flinch. Instead, they looked past him, straight at the woman. "You've kept your promise well," they said quietly, almost respectfully. Her heart jolted at the words. She hadn't heard them in years, not since her husband's last days. It was something he used to say when they struggled through long winters. Keep the promise. Hold the land. How could the stranger know those words? The bandits were too unsettled to notice the exchange. Their nerves frayed further as the storm thundered again, shaking the cabin walls. The younger outlaw muttered something about leaving, but the leader silenced him with a glare. Still, the weight of the moment pressed heavy. The wolves circled slowly, their bodies taut, ready for violence if it came. The woman's eyes shifted between the stranger, the bandits, and the door still gaping open to the storm. She could feel the climax building, the night winding itself tighter and tighter like a snare about to snap. The stranger's hand brushed the inside of their coat. Not pulling a weapon, but reminding the bandits it was there. "You've made a mistake tonight," they said evenly. "And mistakes out here don't end well." The leader sneered, but his hand trembled on the pistol. He was caught between pride and survival, between greed and the instinct to flee. His men looked at him for direction, but for the first time, he had none to give. The woman straightened, her voice cutting through the storm and the silence alike. "Leave now, and maybe the land will let you go. Stay, and it won't." The bandits turned their eyes to her, and in that moment they realized she wasn't bluffing. The wolves weren't bluffing, and perhaps even the storm wasn't bluffing, but still they hesitated. The stranger stepped further into the room, water dripping onto the floorboards, and the fire snapped as though reacting to their presence. The wolves stood rigid, waiting. The woman's breath slowed, steady, though inside her chest her heart beat hard enough to echo. The bandits braced, the leader's finger brushing the trigger, his pride locking him in place. The stranger's hand hovered near their coat. The wolves crouched lower, muscles trembling with restrained power. The woman held her ground, knowing the next second would tip the night into chaos. The storm roared. Lightning lit the cabin in a flash of white, and the world seemed to pause in the breath before the inevitable. And then, as thunder cracked so loud it shook the glass, the leader shouted, his voice raw with desperation, "Now." The room exploded into motion. The leader's cry of "now" was drowned almost instantly by the thunder, but it was enough. The outlaws snapped into motion, guns rising, boots scraping against the floorboards as the storm hurled itself against the cabin walls. The wolves lunged, muscles coiled like springs snapping free, their snarls blending with the crack of a pistol. Smoke filled the small room, the lantern light flickering wildly as chaos burst open. The gray wolf leaped across the overturned chair, knocking one bandit off his feet before his shot could land. The younger outlaw fired into the ceiling in blind panic. Splinters raining down on everyone as he scrambled backward, eyes wide with terror. The scarred man tried to hold his rifle steady, but the black wolf slammed into him, teeth snapping inches from his throat. The leader fired again, the bullet grazing the stranger's coat as they moved with uncanny calm, pulling their own weapon free and leveling it at him. The woman stood in the heart of the storm inside the cabin, her breath sharp but her eyes unshaken. She raised her hand, her voice carrying through the madness. Enough. It wasn't shouted, but it carried such weight that even the wolves froze mid-strike, their growls vibrating low in their throats as they hovered over the fallen men. The stranger's pistol stayed steady on the leader, but they didn't fire. The bandits, stunned by the pause, blinked through the haze of fear and smoke. Realizing the balance had shifted beyond their reach, the leader, his face pale and jaw tight, looked around at his men sprawled on the floor. Weapons scattered, wolves poised to finish what had begun. For the first time that night, the fight drained from his eyes, replaced by something colder: acceptance. He lowered his pistol slowly, his voice hoarse. "Call them off." The woman didn't answer at first. She studied him, the weight of her years pressing into the moment. She thought of her husband, of the promise made to hold the land no matter who came to take it. She thought of the wolves, raised from helpless cubs to guardians strong enough to face down desperate men. And she thought of the stranger, standing steady in the firelight, a reminder that the world still carried mysteries deeper than fear. Her hand dropped to her side, and the wolves, obedient to her will, stepped back, but did not relax. Their golden eyes stayed fixed on the intruders, a living reminder that one wrong move could still end in blood. The stranger spoke then, voice low and even. "You've taken enough from this land. Walk away while you still can." The leader swallowed hard, his pride wounded deeper than any bullet. He glanced at his men, shaken and silent, and he knew the choice was no longer his. Slowly, with the storm still raging outside, he nodded. "Let's go," he muttered. The younger outlaw didn't need telling twice. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm where he had fallen, and staggered toward the door. The scarred one followed, limping, his rifle left behind on the floor. The leader was the last to move, his eyes locking with the woman's one final time. There was no apology in them, only the bitter weight of defeat. Then he stepped into the storm, and the night swallowed them whole. The cabin grew quiet, save for the steady crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The wolves paced in circles, their bodies still taut, but the woman's calm voice soothed them. "It's done," she whispered, and slowly they settled. Their eyes never left the door. The stranger holstered their weapon, their expression unreadable. For a long moment, they studied the woman as though measuring her strength, then finally gave a small nod. "You held your ground well," she tilted her head, still uncertain of who they truly were. "And you?" she asked. "Why come here?" The stranger glanced toward the storm, their gaze distant. "The land speaks louder than people think. I was passing through, and I heard what was stirring." They paused, then added quietly, "You've done what few could. You've made this place yours, not just the walls, but everything tied to it." The woman said nothing. She looked at the wolves at her side, their fur still bristling, their breaths heavy. She thought of the howls that had come from the woods earlier in the night, voices beyond the two at her side. She wondered if the stranger had heard them too, or if they had been meant only for her. The storm began to ease, the thunder rolling farther into the distance, the rain softening into a steady patter. The wolves stretched and lay down by the hearth, their eyes still sharp, but their bodies finally at rest. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but it was still standing. And so was she. The stranger moved toward the door, pausing in the threshold. "They'll talk about this night," they said. "The bandits, the wolves, the woman who stood her ground. Let them. It will keep others from trying the same." The woman met their eyes. "And you? Will I see you again?" The stranger tipped their hat, a faint smile at the corner of their lips. "The land decides that, not me." And with that, they stepped into the fading storm, their figures swallowed by the mist and rain until only the sound of their horses' hooves remained. The woman stood alone again, though not truly alone. The wolves rose and pressed close to her, their warmth a reminder that her family, though different than most, was unbroken. She closed the broken door as best she could, set the lantern back on the table, and sat for the first time since the night began. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them, feeling the weight of survival settle into her bones. She thought of the village, the way folks whispered about her, about the woman who lived with wolves. After tonight, the whispers would turn into stories, and the stories would turn into legends. But she knew the truth. She was not fearless. She was not untouchable. She was simply someone who refused to leave what was hers. Someone who learned that strength was not in the absence of fear, but in standing firm despite it. The wolves lay at her feet, their eyes slowly closing, their breaths evening out. Outside, the plains stretched wide and endless, washed clean by the rain. The storm had passed, but the memory of it lingered. Carved into the wood of the cabin, and the hearts of those who had been inside it, she leaned back, letting her eyes close for a moment, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. In the silence that followed, she heard the faintest sound, the echo of another howl far in the distance, carried on the night air. It was not a warning this time, nor a call to battle. It was simply a reminder that the wild was always near, watching, waiting, and ready to stand with those who respected it. When morning came, the sun would rise over the plains, casting gold across the wet earth. The bandits would be far gone, their pride cut down, and their story twisted by fear. The stranger would vanish into the horizon, leaving only questions. And the woman would still be here, in her home, with the wolves by her side. Life would go on. The chores, the mending, the long nights by the fire. But something had shifted. The land had tested her once again, and she had not faltered. Whatever came next, she knew she would be ready. And so the night ended, not with a scream, nor with defeat, but with a quiet victory carved in silence. A woman, her wolves, and the land they called home stood together still, stronger than any storm, stronger than any bandit, stronger than fear itself.